Mark Galeotti, hello again. You will be in Bucharest, and you will talk in your speech here about the new Putin. So what is new about Vladimir Putin, who decided to start the aggression against Ukraine, comparing to Putin from the last years?
Well, again, it was interesting because when the actual invasion happened, I, like so many, didn't think he was going to invade. And we were basing it on the Putin that we knew from before the COVID era and such like, because obviously we hadn't seen much of him. I think that in some ways the new Putin is much like the old Putin, but in some ways a little bit more exaggerated. I think this is a man who now no longer feels that time is on his side, that feels he's in more of a hurry, and whether that's because of age or the suggestions that he's seriously ill, we don't know. But anyway, for whatever reason, a man who in the past would avoid taking risks, would only move when he thought he was certain how things were going to work out, is now taking more risks. And also a man who increasingly had seen his circle of people he listened to shrink and shrink, again, now seems to be listening to no one but himself, and his own sense of his sort of historical destiny almost.
You are talking about the people who he is listening to. You wrote about this mafia superpower, about the so-called vory v zagone in Russia. How does this system work, and who is Putin relying on now? Who is, I don't know, holding his back?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, obviously, although people have called Russia a mafia state, I never quite like that description. Maybe it's because it's the academic pedant in me or whatever, because it implies that the gangsters rule the state or the state controls the gangsters, and it's more complex than that. But I think what is clear is that this is an essentially exploitative and kleptocratic state in which the people who have power use that power to enrich themselves and protect themselves. And in that respect, morally, there's not a huge difference between them and the gangsters. I mean, at least I remember talking to someone within the criminal world who said, look, at least we're honest about it. And I think there's a certain truth there. But if we look at what's happened, in many ways, the rise of the Putin state has been the rise of this kleptocratic state. And Putin has been successful precisely because he allowed a lot of people to get very, very rich, so long as they supported him and they maintained the status quo. The thing is that now we've moved into an almost monarchical stage of Putinism. He's no longer just simply the guy you support because it's pragmatic, but he seems to think himself as almost monarch by right. And I think as a result of this, not only has his personal circle shrunk, but what we see is now this is a system which has no Putinists, in the sense of, I don't think there are people who feel any kind of personal, emotional, or ideological commitment to Putin or what he's doing. It is rather that this is a system in which it is very, very dangerous to do anything but to support the boss. And I think we're seeing this now, that it's clear that there's a lot of people in the system, at the top of the system, who are very unhappy. We have the oligarchs whose property abroad is being sanctioned and frozen and taken. But they also know that if they criticize Putin and the war, they run the risk of losing everything and even ending up in prison. We have the people within the government, particularly the ones who are running the economy and the political system, clearly fully aware of the crisis that is hitting them. The chairwoman of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, a very, very able operator, she has said that this war is flushing our economy into the sewers. But what can they do? I mean, ultimately, all they're doing is just doing their best to keep the system going, because they have no real power to influence Putin. Putin is not listening to them. Putin is not willing to give them any opportunities. And so they have a choice: continue to serve or find yourself being pushed out. If you're lucky, you're just sacked. If you're unlucky, worse happens. And so I think this is it at the moment. Who protects Putin? Well, obviously there are his bodyguards. There are people who are similarly committed to the conflict in Ukraine and asserting what they think of as Russia's great place in the world. and for whom Putin is convenient because he also believes it. But again, they're not doing it because they're Putin supporters. It's because Putin is doing what they want. But I think for most people, it's just the situation that the risks in not supporting Putin are too great. And therefore, everyone follows. But of course, that creates a very brittle system in which, if things start to change, and we saw this, I mean, again, if one thinks of what happened in Romania, what happened in other Warsaw Pact countries in '89, states can look very powerful and very solid, and then very quickly fall apart.
Yeah, but it took decades.
It took decades, but I mean, we're not there. We're not there now. I mean, in the sense of, I don't. This system is not going to last for decades. Not least because I don't think Putin is going to last for decades. And I think this is it. This is the Putin system. If he dies tomorrow, this system will have to change. There is no way it can continue. So I think, for all these reasons, yeah, I mean, it's a very brittle situation we're in now.
You said that the system will have to change. Realistically, who can replace Putin, and how different will be from Putin?
Well, I think the interesting thing is that now I would say no one can replace Putin. 3 months ago, there was one figure who probably was a credible one, which is the defense minister, Shoigu. Because he's an able political operator, he's nationalistic enough to appeal to the nationalists, but also pragmatic enough to appeal to the technocrats. And almost uniquely within the Russian political system, he seems to have managed to rise without making enemies. Pretty much everyone else has someone at least who hates them or fears them and would block them. But of course, the war now, has rather tarnished Shoigu's star. We shouldn't necessarily rule him out. He's a very, very cunning political operator, but still the idea that he's now the clear successor is gone. So there isn't anyone. And I think that's important because, again, I mean, it's different if it's a managed process, but let's say, again, Putin dies tomorrow morning. You would have a situation in which a collection of powerful interests are trying to work out what's going to happen. I mean, constitutionally, the prime minister, Mishustin, becomes interim president and there have to be elections in 3 months. But Mishustin himself is not strong enough to just be able to take power. So I think you would actually get a collection of people, more or less forming a kind of collective leadership. And then either they would agree on a new president, who is one of them, or they might go for a president who is going to be a figurehead. I mean, we might see, bizarre though it seems, Dmitry Medvedev coming back even. If you're looking for a weak president whom no one fears, Medvedev's your man. So, these things are all possible, but the main thing is it will be a collection of different interests. And I think that's important because it means that there will be the economic interests, the technocratic interests will be represented. And therefore, you'll probably get a shift away from this incredibly confrontational position with the West towards something a little bit more conciliatory, because frankly, pretty much everyone is aware that this current situation is disastrous for Russia and cannot be allowed to continue long term.
No, when Stalin died, it took, I believe, a few days for the system to reinvent itself. But
well, I mean, and likewise, it's interesting you draw that parallel. I wouldn't be surprised if Putin died tomorrow that we wouldn't hear about it until for that same reason. They're not going to announce anything until they've sorted things out between them.
I would like to stop a little bit and talk about how the Western leaders are dealing with Putin. The French president recommends a cautious approach in order to maintain dialogue. Vladimir Putin far better than most people. Is this really the best approach? I don't know, can anyone negotiate anything anymore with Putin?
Putin is not insane. He believes some insane things, which has led to this current situation. But I think there is still a rational actor there. I think he's less controlled. He's a little bit less balanced than has in the past, but he's not insane. So I think, dialogue is always important. It's a really banal point to make, but I think we need to continue that conversation. The idea that somehow by talking to Putin we legitimate him Well, he's president of a nuclear power. I mean, he doesn't need our legitimation in that respect. And, you know, if one thinks about that conversation, for example, I mean, Macron talked to Putin to a large extent to try and get through to Putin the extent to which so much of what he was claiming was not true, you know, about the idea that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis and so forth. And it seems that he was entirely unsuccessful, that Putin absolutely would not deviate from his line and so forth. But it's important to try these kinds of things. So, I mean, I think that the important point is this. You know, most wars end with some kind of a peace deal. And that means some kind of a conversation with someone. And so long as even the Ukrainians are willing to, you know, entertain the thought that at some point there will be talks with the Russians, then we shouldn't be ruling it out in the West. The point is not to either think that's it, we just have to rely on dialogue, or we just have to rely on the military and, you know, the political and economic as well as the shooting wars that are taking place. We have to balance the two. It's only because of the pressure in Ukraine and the pressure on the Russian economy that Putin will be willing to talk maybe someday. But likewise, if we don't talk to Putin, then this is a war that will frankly never end.
You talked about nuclear weapons. It's a topic, an important topic these days. Nuclear power is what Russia needs in order to be a great power, like United States. So how likely is to see Russia using a tactical weapon, a nuclear weapon, a chemical one?
I think it's still unlikely. I mean, again, it's one of these things, 3 months ago, I'd have said not a chance. Now, I mean, given the extent to which Putin's own fate and his kind of place in history is tied up with this war, it's not totally impossible to think he might at some point reach a stage where he feels, look, you know, we're in a stalemate that ultimately is not favoring us. We need to think of some dramatic move to break it. I mean, I think chemical weapons, I can't really see any utility for them. Chemical weapons are not really good battlefield weapons. They're maybe useful for clearing cities, but even then, not really. A tactical nuclear weapon. The thing is that Russia hasn't even had exercises involving its tactical nuclear weapons since 1990. So that it has between 1,800 and 2,000 warheads. But on the other hand, I mean, these are scattered between 12 arsenals around the country. But the main thing is they are in mothballs. They are, you know, basically wrapped up with minimal maintenance. If they were going to use a tactical nuclear weapon, they would have to take one of these warheads and recondition it. They would have to move it to where it will be added to its missile delivery system. And that means you know, a quite extensive and specialized convoy, because you don't just put a tactical nuclear weapon on the back of a van, you know. And it would then have to be sort of, you know, connected to that. And all this would have to be done by technicians who will have had no practical experience doing this. They would just be doing it from instruction manuals, which, you know, it takes time. And the main thing is, look, these various arms depots are the focus for extensive Western intelligence activity. Spy satellites, technical intelligence, human intelligence, you name it. We will almost certainly know if they are preparing a tactical nuclear weapon for use, which will give us a chance to try and intercede and try and stop them or whatever. So, you know, it is possible. There are no obvious military targets. It would just be a kind of a terror weapon to try and force Ukraine or the West into some kind of submission. One could also see the possibility of like a nuclear test, launching a nuclear missile at sort of some, you know, ocean target, just simply to kind of try and scare us. But they are still, I think, at the extreme end of what Putin might consider. For practical reasons, but also for 3 other reasons. One is it would change how the West respond. We would start thinking of Putin as actively dangerous. And I think the calls for the West to start moving towards actively trying to bring Putin down would increase, there's no question. Secondly, within Russia itself, it's something that would scare a lot of figures within the elite, including the military elite. And there's the, you know, from Putin's point of view, there's the risk it might push people, them, saying, actually, he's got too dangerous. But thirdly, something we sometimes forget is China. China is really keen to keep the nuclear taboo in place, not least for practical reasons. If and when they take Taiwan, they don't want to run the risk of an American or indeed Taiwanese tactical nuclear sort of response. And of course, the Chinese have a lot of investment in Ukraine. Until the current blockade, Ukraine was the largest exporter of corn to China. There's all kinds of reasons why actually the Chinese have a sort of stake in this. So very long-winded answer, because the honest answer is obviously I don't know, but I still think it's highly unlikely. But on the other hand, if it really does come down to a very, very stark surrender or escalation choice, Putin will escalate because he can do nothing else. And again, this is one of the reasons for keeping the dialogue going.
We are seeing these days a Russian priest from a Russian Orthodox Church supporting this war. What is the role of Russian Orthodox Church? We are talking, there is a book even about nuclear orthodoxy, for example. It's a good book. I mean, it's interesting. Look, historically, the Russian Orthodox Church has always been basically the sort of, part of in some ways, almost the entourage of the Tsar. Because as far as they were concerned, Moscow was the third Rome, the last Rome, and that it was their duty to keep this cradle of the genuine orthodoxy sort of alive. And we've seen that in some ways, that tradition being restored under Putin. In many ways, I once kind of lightheartedly speculated that really the Russian Orthodox Church should just simply be considered to be another arm of the Russian state or a corporation, because the extent to which, as part of the deal whereby the Orthodox Church supports Putin, they get all kinds of perks and benefits, including still things like sort of taxation exemptions and such like. So it's an economic interest. I think now that Putin has moved into this very, not just nationalist, but almost kind of civilizational stage of the conflict, Patriarch Kirill is openly supportive. Every now and then he says, "Oh, but we don't like war and we don't like fighting." But we still see Russian Orthodox priests blessing Russian tanks. Though Kirill did say in, I think it was 2020, that they should stop blessing nuclear weapons. So at least that's something. But no, I think this is it. The Russian Orthodox Church is politically, economically, and ideologically, in some ways, harnessed to the Kremlin. And it's a two-way relationship. They get all kinds of benefits from it, but nonetheless, it can't step away. But on the other hand, it is clear that this is causing serious tensions within the church. There are ordinary priests and deacons who are, we've had an open letter being signed by many sort of saying that this war is terrible. We have Russian Orthodox churches outside of Russia breaking with the Russian hierarchy and so forth. I think this is the problem. You harness yourself to a Kremlin, which will then get involved in an aggressive war of imperialism. You can expect the negative consequences. You have mentioned Putin's sickness. A few days ago, I believe an Italian newspaper reported that he was very, very ill and operated even from cancer, I believe. Could be a true information here, or maybe is this part of information warfare?
It's a very good question, because yes, it's interesting that Ukrainians have very much been supporting and repeating these ideas about Putin's illness, because it suits them to encourage dismay and division in Russia. And it has to be said, the Ukrainians have been fighting a very, very effective information war, like all their other wars. Look, on the one hand, I genuinely do believe that there is something wrong with Putin medically. Just from seeing him this year, whether it's from the puffy face to the uncontrollable twitches we've seen, that sort of strange footage of him kind of holding onto a table desperately. There is something, and it also seems to be affecting his character. He always presented himself as in control, this sort of controlled chief executive, and now we see someone who is clearly short-tempered, speaking with a lot more emotion, negative emotion, but emotion. However, first of all, look, none of it, everyone becomes an amateur doctor in these circumstances and makes their own diagnosis. We don't know, and just a few bits of television footage do not, constitute that. I mean, I've spoken to people in government circles who clearly sort of look at this a lot more seriously, and they say that they're not entirely sure, and they don't think it's anything that is likely to be quickly fatal or to incapacitate him. They think this is something that will last. But of course, first of all, Putin's health has always been a taboo issue within Russia. I mean, even we know that he has this, recurring back issues, for example. And from time to time, he sort of more or less disappears from view for a few weeks, which may well be because that's flared up. But of course, we're never ever told anything. In that environment, of course, rumors spread. Nature abhors a vacuum, and information vacuums get filled with rumors. And everyone wants to kind of pretend that they have some deep inside knowledge. So yes, it's Parkinson's, we're told, or it's thyroid cancer, or it's blood cancer, or whatever.
And maybe he only has arthritis at his age.
Exactly. I mean, whatever. So I think we shouldn't put too much faith in the specific rumors. But on the other hand, it's clear, first of all, that there is something wrong with him. And secondly, this is going to have a destabilizing effect in Russia. Because again, obviously the timeframes we have no idea about, but it inevitably once again gets people thinking about a Russia after Putin.
What's the role of FSB, a political bureau, in this war?
Well, I mean, the FSB is an absolutely central element, really, to Putin's governance. But, it's an institution like any other. It has its own interests. I mean, I think it's clear that the FSB, in conjunction with its former head and now Security Council Secretary, Nikolai Patrushev, has been very much on the hawkish end of the debate, and no doubt has been encouraging Putin and, again, spreading the kind of nonsense that we know has basically informed Putin's strategy. Putin clearly believed genuinely that this was a state that was near collapse, that the slightest push and it will go, and the Ukrainians themselves would, on the whole, not resist a Russian takeover. Now, to a large extent, this probably comes from just people the sort of people he talks to, but clearly it also has come from FSB briefing. And that just simply, as much as anything else, reflects the fact that Putin has created a system in which no one dares tell the boss the truth. But he's made it clear what he wants to hear, and so he's told what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. So I think the FSB is a significant element of that, but we shouldn't assume that it's dominant. I mean, there's been talk, for example, about one of the deputy heads of the FSB being put under arrest. Some people have questioned that. It's uncertain, but nonetheless, it is clear that it is not the only interest that's powerful within the Russian system. There's also the military. There are also various economic interests. There are just the friends of Putin, and so it goes. And I think this just simply emphasizes the degree to which policymaking in it's Russia, these days, is about who can persuade the boss. That's the key thing. And the FSB has all kinds of advantages. It's Putin's old service. It speaks the kind of language that he responds to. It has the right kind of perspectives. But that doesn't mean to say that it's somehow in charge of what's going on.
What's the worst case scenario for Ukraine? Because Russia's strategy right now seems to move toward a word of attrition, let's say it.
I mean, I'm not honestly sure how far it's Russian strategy or just the natural logic of the battlefield. I mean, the Russians, they've taken their land corridor to Crimea. They have now kind of almost, downscaled their ambitions to just taking the Donbass region. It's questionable whether this offensive will actually manage to do that. I think it's highly unlikely, to be honest. They might make a little bit more progress, but not very much. And unless they mobilize, they won't have the forces for another offensive this year, I don't think. I mean, the worst case scenario, I mean, let's say the worst probable case for Ukraine is, I think, what's actually going to happen, which is that this bogs down into a long-term and protracted deadlock with neither side strong enough to defeat the other, but both sides strong enough not to be defeated. In some ways, I think the worst case scenario for Ukraine is not that the war continues, because I think that's almost certainly going to happen, at least for another months, maybe a year, is that actually the West loses interest. And other crises emerge, or whatever. That I think would be what would be truly disastrous, because although the Ukrainians are clearly continuing to be willing to resist, though we don't know how many casualties they're taking. I mean, that's an uncertainty. But the point is, it's not just that they need continued flow of weapons, which they do, but look, their economy might decline by 50% of GDP this year. I mean, it's a lot more support that they're going to need. If they don't have that, then it's going to be very hard for them to actually continue the fight.
And we are seeing already that the economical crisis in Europe is the main theme. In France, for example, during the electoral campaign, pouvoir d'achat was the main theme, not the war.
Yeah, absolutely. And likewise, I mean, here in the UK, where clearly we've been amongst the sort of the most forward in providing support for Ukrainians. But even so, I mean, it's the front page political stories are exactly, they are about inflation, they are about fuel prices, they are actually about domestic issues. And the question is, at what point will there be a backlash, to sending hundreds of millions of pounds or euros worth of military equipment and other support to Ukraine. I was talking to a deputy minister in Prague about a month back, who was responsible for example, the refugee issue. And he was saying, look, I'm just amazed there hasn't been a social backlash yet. But yeah, it'll probably come. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why actually this is a real issue. And we have the American midterms coming up in November. How far is that going to distract the administration or indeed weaken it?
And this will be in Putin's advantage. He already used a refugee crisis in Belarus last year, for example.
I mean, this is it. There's so many issues, which, I mean, and the growing food crisis. Actually, to a large extent, the fact that there will be real hunger around the world, but particularly in the global south, is actually down to the war and down to the fact that Russia has effectively mounted a blockade of Odessa. But actually, where's the blame going? The blame is more going towards Western sanctions. If you ask people in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere, why are food prices going up? They'll say it's because of Western sanctions. That's going to be another issue we have to deal with. I mean, it doesn't mean to say that everything's good for Putin. I mean, I think September is when we're going to start seeing serious political and economic problems in Russia. I think they can manage okay until autumn, but that's when I think we're really going to start. So in some ways, it's almost going to be a question of a war which is going to be determined by which side loses first, rather than which side wins.
So it will be also an information war.
Yeah, well, we have to remember, look, there's two wars that are in a way happening at the moment. There is a very 20th century military war taking place in Ukraine, and there is a very 21st century war of economy, of information, of politics, of culture that is between the West and Russia. And at the moment they're in parallel. But again, what happens if one side or the other begins to sort of move apart? I mean, in part, it could be, does the West begin to lose interest? But it's also, I mean, what happens if, for example, Ukraine does start striking more obviously into Russian territory and uses Western supplied weapons for that? Some Western countries are going to say, well, that's fine, that's war. Others are going to be, we know, are going to be a lot more uncomfortable about that. So there's still all kinds of room for division in the future.
It's my last questions. Russia keeps the world in check with this nuclear threat we have been talking about. Meanwhile, people are kidnapped, women are raped, children are killed. Can we compare Russia to a terrorist organization?
No, I think it's just that nuclear weapons in some ways are an intrinsically terrorizing force. I mean, even if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, what would we be doing? I mean, it's not as though we would actually have NATO forces preparing to attack St. Petersburg or similar. Yes, nuclear weapons are the ultimate backstop, but their use is actually in some ways quite limited. I mean, nuclear weapons didn't stop Argentina from taking the Falkland Islands from Britain, because they knew ultimately Britain was not going to launch its weapons and turn Buenos Aires into a smoking ruin. Nuclear weapons were not enough to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I mean, actually, in some ways, I think that we focus too much on the nuclear dimension. And actually, that almost acts as an alibi that we in the West say, well, what can we do? Because Russia has nuclear weapons. Well, the thing is that actually, what would we be doing if they didn't? And I don't think it would be anything particularly different.